That night with my son, Liam, was by far the most unexpected yet exhilarating experience of my life. I'm Emma, and I want to share a story about something that happened between me and my son, Liam. It's not easy to talk about, but it's something I've kept bottled up for too long. Liam is 19 now, but everything began a few years ago, after my husband, Mark, passed away. Losing Mark was one of the toughest challenges I've ever faced, leaving Liam and me to figure out how to go on without him. At first, it was hard. Liam withdrew, spending most of his time in his room or hanging out with friends. He avoided talking about Mark or his death, and I didn't want to push him. Instead, I focused on making our home as warm and welcoming as I could. I cooked his favorite meals, left little notes of encouragement on his desk, and tried to make sure he knew I was there if he ever needed to talk. But for months, he kept his distance. Then, one evening, he walked into the kitchen while I was cleaning up after dinner. His sudden presence startled me, but I was glad to see him. It wasn't often that he approached me like this. "Do you need help, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft yet steady. I turned, surprised by the offer. "Sure, you can dry the dishes," I said, handing him a towel. We worked together in silence for a while, and I felt a small sense of relief. It was the first time in ages he'd voluntarily spent time with me. "How was school today?" I asked, hoping to start a conversation. "It was fine," he replied without looking up. That was all. I didn't push him any further. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here," I added gently, glancing at him from the corner of my eye. He nodded, but didn't say more. Over the following weeks, I began noticing small changes. Liam spent more time with me, sitting in the living room while I watched TV or helping me with small tasks around the house. He even started to open up more, telling me about his classes and his plans for college. I felt a glimmer of hope, thinking we were finally starting to reconnect. But then, one evening, something happened that made me question everything. We were having dinner together, and Liam had cooked a simple pasta dish he'd learned from a friend. As we ate, he looked at me and said, "You're amazing, Mom." I laughed a little, brushing off the compliment. "Thanks, Liam, that means a lot," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. But his expression didn't change. He looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "What's wrong?" I asked softly, though I felt cautious. "Nothing," he quickly replied, shaking his head. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." I nodded, unsure how to respond. The moment felt strange, but I told myself I was overthinking it. He was just being kind, wasn't he? The strange night hadn't happened yet, but this was definitely the beginning of it. After that evening, things started to shift. Liam began finding more reasons to be close to me, sitting next to me on the couch or lingering in the kitchen while I cooked. At first, I thought it was sweet. I told myself he was just trying to reconnect after we'd each grieved in our own way. But then there were the looks, his gaze lingering on me longer than it should. His compliments became more frequent and personal. "You look really nice today, Mom," he said one morning while I was washing dishes. "Thanks, sweetheart," I replied, trying to sound casual. But the way he said it, the way he looked at me, made me feel uncomfortable. One evening, we were watching a movie, one Liam had picked out, a comedy we'd both seen a dozen times. Halfway through, I realized he was sitting closer to me than usual. Our shoulders were nearly touching, and when I shifted, he didn't pull away. "You're always so busy," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You never take time for yourself." I smiled a little, caught off guard. "That's what moms do, Liam. There's always something to take care of." He shook his head, his gaze fixed on me. "You do too much. You deserve a break." His words made my chest tighten. "That's sweet of you to say," I replied, "but I'm fine really." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. Was it just an innocent comment, or was there something more to it? What was happening between us? In the days that followed, I noticed Liam finding more reasons to be near me. If I was cooking, he'd come into the kitchen to chat. If I was in the garden, he'd sit outside with me. His compliments kept coming, each one making me feel more uneasy. And, to be honest, I found myself doing the same thing, spending more time around him, too. "You make this house feel alive," he said one afternoon as I folded laundry. I froze, unsure how to respond. "Thank you, Liam," I said, forcing a smile. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, and not in a way that felt comfortable. The unease I felt only grew. I tried telling myself I was just imagining things, that Liam was just being kind, maybe even trying to make up for the distance between us after Mark's death. But it wasn't just the compliments. It was the way he acted around me. He was always there, always finding excuses to be close. And yet, I still didn't understand why I was doing the same thing to him. One afternoon, I was chopping vegetables in the kitchen when I heard Liam approach. His footsteps were soft on the tiled floor. I didn't turn around, focusing on my task, hoping he'd just grab a snack and leave. "Do you need help, Mom?" he asked. I glanced over my shoulder and gave him a quick smile. "Sure. You can slice these carrots," I said, sliding the cutting board toward him. He stepped beside me, his movements deliberate as he began cutting. We worked in silence for a while, and I thought maybe it would just be a quiet, pleasant moment. But then he stopped, looked at me, and said, "You've done so much for me." His voice was low, and I glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, after Dad died, you've taken care of everything." "You didn't have to, but you did," he said, his eyes locking with mine. A pang of emotion hit my chest. "Of course I did, Liam. You're my son. I love you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, but his gaze didn't break. "I just don't think I ever said thank you for all of it." "You don't have to thank me," I replied quickly, turning back to the stove. "That's what moms do." He didn't say anything else, but I could feel him watching me. The moment felt too heavy, too intense, and I wanted it to end. Finally, he picked up the knife and began cutting again, and I exhaled, relieved. After dinner that night, I sat on the couch with a book, hoping to get lost in it. Liam came into the living room and sat down next to me, not at the other end of the couch like usual, but right next to me. "What are you reading?" he asked, leaning in to get a closer look at the cover. "It's just a novel," I said, holding it up for him to see. "Nothing too exciting." "Can I read it with you?" His question took me by surprise. Liam hadn't been interested in reading for years, and I couldn't remember the last time we shared a quiet moment like this. A part of me wanted to say no, to tell him I needed some time alone, but another part of me didn't want to shut him out. "Sure," I replied, shifting over a little to give him space. He moved in close, his shoulder brushing mine as I began reading aloud. At first, it felt like just another normal moment between us, like the ones we used to have before things got so complicated. But as time passed, I began to notice how close he was sitting, how intently he was looking at me, not the book. When I finished the chapter, I put the book down. "That's enough for tonight," I said, trying to keep things light. "Thanks for reading with me," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You're welcome," I replied, standing up and heading toward my bedroom. "Good night, Liam." "Good night, Mom," he answered, but there was a tone in his voice I couldn't quite identify. The next morning, when I walked into the kitchen, Liam was already there. He had made coffee and prepared breakfast, a gesture I hadn't seen from him in a long time. "Good morning, Mom," he said cheerfully. "I made you some coffee." "Thank you, Liam," I replied cautiously, sitting down at the table. He sat across from me, watching me closely as I took a sip. "You work so hard," he said suddenly. "You deserve to be taken care of, too." I swallowed, unsure how to respond. "That's very sweet of you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but you don't have to do all of this for me." "I want to," he said, his voice firm and sincere. After breakfast, I went outside to the garden, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The cool breeze and the smell of blooming flowers calmed me as I sat on the bench, staring at the garden, trying to figure out what was going on. I didn't know how long I had been sitting there when I heard footsteps approaching. I turned to see Liam walking toward me, hands in his pockets. "Can I sit with you?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Of course," I answered, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted him to sit with me. He sat down next to me, leaving a small gap between us. We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds being the rustling leaves and distant birds. "You've been quiet lately," he finally said. "I've just had a lot on my mind. I replied, keeping my eyes on the garden. Is it about me? He asked, his voice soft but serious. The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated before answering. Why would you think that? He shrugged. I don't know. I just feel like maybe I've done something to upset you. No, you haven't upset me, I said quickly. I've just been really tired. He nodded but didn't say anything else. After a few minutes, he stood up. I'll leave you alone, he said quietly. I watched him head back into the house, a knot of guilt twisting in my stomach. He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? Why did I feel so uncomfortable? The following days felt off, like a thick cloud had settled over the house. I tried to keep up with my usual routine, cooking, cleaning, and trying to keep things normal, but every time Liam was around, I felt a growing unease. He hadn't done anything outwardly strange, but there was something in his presence that felt different. Then one night after dinner, I decided to distance myself a little. I retreated to my bedroom earlier than usual, hoping for some quiet time to unwind. I curled up with a book, the soft light of the lamp creating a small, comforting cocoon. For the first time, I felt a mix of tension and something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I didn't want to admit it, but the idea of Liam kept circling in my thoughts. Just as I began to feel a little more at ease, there was a soft knock at my door. Mom? Liam's voice was low, almost unsure. I hesitated before answering. Yes. Can I come in? I looked at the clock. It was well past the time Liam usually went to bed. Is something wrong? I asked, sitting up a little. I wanted to talk, he replied. I sighed, setting my book aside. Come in. The door creaked open, and Liam stepped inside. There was something about him that felt different, less like the confident young man he usually was, and more like the little boy I used to comfort after bad dreams. He paused at the doorway for a moment, as if unsure whether to come any closer. What's on your mind? I asked, patting the edge of the bed. He sat down slowly, his movements deliberate. For a moment he didn't speak, his eyes glued to the floor. Then he looked up, meeting my gaze. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, he said quietly. For what? I asked, my voice cautious. For making you feel uncomfortable, he said, his tone filled with sincerity. I know I've been acting differently lately, and I don't want you to think I'm trying to make things weird between us. I blinked, taken aback by his honesty. Liam, I started, but he interrupted me. I've been feeling a lot of things, and I don't really know how to handle them, he said, his voice breaking slightly. But I don't want to hurt you. His words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning I wasn't sure I could understand. I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Liam, it's okay to feel confused sometimes, I said gently. But you have to remember, I'm your mom. There are boundaries in our relationship. He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I know. I'm sorry, he whispered. I gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before pulling my hand away. Let's not worry about it right now, I said, trying to sound lighthearted. We'll figure this out together. There was still a strange, unspoken tension between us, something I couldn't fully name. The look in his eyes told me there was more to come, and I gave him the same look back. He nodded again, standing up. Good night, Mom, he said softly, before leaving the room. I watched him go, a strange mixture of relief and sadness filling me. He had acknowledged the tension between us, which felt like a step forward. But I couldn't help wondering if things would really go back to normal. One thing I knew for sure was that this wouldn't be the last time he came to me like that. And I was right. I was definitely right. The next morning, I woke up feeling more tired than usual. The conversation with Liam had kept me awake for hours, my mind racing with unanswered questions and what-ifs. I went through my usual morning routine, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling lingering inside me. Liam seemed different that day, more quiet and withdrawn. He stayed to himself, spending most of his time in his room. Part of me wanted to check on him to make sure he was all right, but another part felt it was best to give him some space. That evening, while I was folding laundry in the living room, Liam walked in and sat down on the couch without saying anything. He watched me silently as I worked, and the quiet between us felt thick, almost heavy. I struggled to come up with something to break the silence. "You've been quiet today," I finally said, glancing at him. He just shrugged. "Anything on your mind?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "About us," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze for a second, the weight of his words hitting me hard. "What do you mean?" I asked, my tone cautious. He hesitated, his eyes meeting mine. "I know things have been strange lately, and I don't want it to stay like this," he admitted. I nodded slowly, not quite sure how to respond. "I don't want that either," I said after a pause. "But we need to figure out how to move forward." He gave a faint smile, nodding.
"We will," he said.
For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things could improve. Maybe we could work through this and rebuild. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something I wasn't sure I fully understood, or maybe I did, but wasn't ready to face it. The quiet unease that had settled in the house didn't go away. Liam tried to act like everything was normal, but I could see the struggle in his eyes. The way he hesitated before speaking, or how he lingered too long when we crossed paths. I wanted to believe that his apology had meant we were done with all this, but deep inside, I knew it wasn't that simple. Then, one night, while I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone to relax, it happened again. The house was quiet, only the soft creak of the ceiling fan above me breaking the silence. I had just started to drift off when I heard a faint knock on my bedroom door. "Mom?" Liam's voice was soft, almost unsure. I sat up, my heart sinking. "Yes." "Can I come in?" he asked. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. "Liam, it's late," I said, trying to keep my tone firm. "What's wrong?" There was a pause before he answered. I just need to talk to you." Something in his voice made me hesitate. I took a deep breath and then said, "Okay, come in." The door creaked as it opened, and Liam stepped inside, looking uncertain. His hands were shoved in his pockets as he stood by the door. "What is it, Liam?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated again, glancing between me and the floor. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said the other night," he started, his voice low. "I feel like I need to be honest with you." My chest tightened. "Honest about what?" I asked cautiously. He stepped closer, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "About how I feel," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know it's wrong, and I've tried to ignore it, but I can't stop thinking about you, Mom." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at him, my mind racing. "Liam, you can't," I began, but he quickly cut me off. "I know," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. You've been everything to me since Dad died. You're kind and strong, and you've done so much for me. I don't know how to stop feeling this way." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt frozen, unable to move or speak, as his confession hung in the air. "Liam, you're my son," I finally said, my voice shaking. "I love you, but not like that. This has to stop," he whispered, tears starting to well in his eyes. "I know," he said. "I just needed to tell you." I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Liam, what you're feeling is a result of everything we've been through. It's not real. You're young and you're confused, but this isn't right. We need to work through this together." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "I know," I said, my heart breaking at the sight of him. "But we can't let this continue. You're a good person, Liam, and you'll move past this." He wiped his eyes and stood up slowly. "Good night, Mom," he said, his voice barely audible. "Good night," I replied, watching as he left the room and closed the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door and sat on the bed, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I felt overwhelmed with guilt and confusion, questioning everything I had done that might have led to this. I loved Liam with all my heart, but his feelings were something I couldn't ignore. That night, I barely slept, replaying his words in my mind over and over, trying to make sense of them. I told myself it was just a phase, a moment of confusion that would pass, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, Liam was quiet. He barely said a word at breakfast, And when he left for school, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I spent the day focusing on work, but my mind kept drifting back to our conversation. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. When Liam came home that evening, he seemed distant, avoiding eye contact and retreating to his room almost immediately. I wanted to talk to him, to make sure he was okay, but I didn't know where to start. I felt trapped, unsure of how to handle the situation without making things worse. Later that night, I was sitting in the living room, staring at the TV without really watching it. The house was quiet, and I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Liam standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course." He walked over and sat down on the couch, leaving a small space between us. We sat in silence for a while, the tension between us almost unbearable. "Mom," he said finally, his voice soft. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said quickly. "But we need to set boundaries, Liam. For both of us." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I understand." I reached out, placing a hand on his knee. "We'll get through this," I said gently. "But you have to trust me." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with emotion. "I do," he replied. I gave him a small smile, hoping to reassure him. "Then we'll be okay." As I sat there, I felt a flicker of hope that we could move past this, but deep down, I knew it would take time. The days following our conversation were tense, but quiet. Liam kept his distance, and I tried to act like everything was normal, but the truth weighed heavily on me.